Imagine sitting in a prison cell and contemplating life, and how it will be all over quite soon. You're going to be executed by way of hanging, and no doubt you're wondering how that will go. You hope it'll be quick. It's not so much oblivion that scares you, but the fact that hanging might not go exactly as it should, and you'll spend some seconds or even minutes in agonizing pain. It wouldn't be the first time a man has been left dangling with life still in him. One thing you're not considering at all is the possibility of surviving your execution, never mind surviving 3 attempts to execute you. Welcome to the life of John Lee, the criminal they just couldn't kill. Before we get to the momentous moment in history that tainted the image of the British authorities, and before we investigate the theories as to why the job at hand failed, you need to know a bit about hanging in the first place. That way you might better understand how John Lee escaped with his life intact. Prior to the British getting a bit more humane about this method of execution, it was quite brutal, albeit likely a better way to go than past forms of execution such as being burned or boiled or torn apart at the limbs. Hanging in the old days might have involved climbing onto something and then having your neck put inside a noose. Then the object is taken from under the person and they die from strangulation. In the 19th century, scientists aired their views and said dislocating the neck was a more humane way to kill someone than strangulation on a rope. In 1866, the idea was proposed to drop the person from a certain height to ensure this quick snap and ensuing death. This method was called a standard drop. At the time, a scientist named Samuel Houghton said the height of the drop to secure a fast death should be between 4 and 6 feet. That way, there would be no dangling and terrible discomfort. The standard drop was soon seen as backwards due to the fact that it didn't take into account a person's height and weight. In 1872, a new method was introduced that was called the long drop. The person was connected to a noose and stood on a scaffold which had a trap door. When the door was opened, down fell the body. The authorities had to calculate the proportions of the person's body so that the neck would snap and kill the person quickly, but not drop the person so much that he or she would be decapitated. This can and has happened, and while death is death, losing the head was not something anyone wanted to see. So that's where we were around the time of Mr. John Lee is going to go to the scaffold. On November 15, 1884, he murdered a woman named Emma Ann Whitehead Keyes. This happened in a small village called Babbacombe, which is in Devon in the south of England. Lee was arrested but always protested that he was innocent of the crime. But there was some evidence to the contrary, including a knife wound that he had incurred during the murder. The woman had been killed with a knife. Prior to her downfall, Keyes had lived alone with her servants and cooks, and Lee had once worked there too. He left that job, joined the Navy, returned to Devon, and was arrested for stealing. After his release from prison, he returned to the manor and worked for Keyes again. It was perhaps a bad move on her part to take him back in. When she was found dead, there had only been one person in the house at the time, and that was Lee. Then there was the cut on his arm, which pointed at his guilt. Besides that, there wasn't really anything else the police had on him, and in 1884, there was no CSI Devon. Maybe it wasn't him who had committed the murder, and he certainly thought he'd been falsely convicted. He once said, "The reason I'm so calm is that I trust in the Lord, and He knows I'm innocent." He was sentenced to be hanged at Exeter Prison on the 23rd of February, 1884. On the day of the event, the executioner, named James Barry, went through the checks. Scaffold, all good. Noose, correctly tied. Trap door, working fine. What could possibly go wrong? All we know is that Lee was taken to the scaffold and his head was fastened to the noose. A white hood was put over his head, and when the signal was given, the trap door didn't open. They tried again, and then again. And you can only imagine what was going through Lee's mind after each time he gritted his teeth and prepared for the great unknown. This was a total embarrassment for anyone involved, and the medical officer said enough is enough. He said he can't hang around any longer after those failures. Lee was unfastened from the noose the last time and was taken back to prison. But what actually went wrong, since the entire apparatus had been tested? Well, the executioner wrote about the experience as well as some other 130-plus executions in a book called My Experiences as an Executioner. He admitted in that book that the science didn't always work, and some men died too slowly or lost their heads. But Lee's case was extraordinary. These are 2 excerpts from that book. 1. On the Saturday, I examined this drop and reported it was much too frail for its purpose, but I worked the lever and found that the doors dropped all right. 2. The noise of the bolt sliding could be plainly heard, but the doors did not fall. I stamped on the drop to shake it loose, and so did some of the warders, but none of our efforts could stir it. Lee stood like a statue, making no sound or sign. Between each attempt, they actually took Lee away. He had the hood removed from his head and was taken to a room. The authorities then tried the trapdoor mechanism again, and it worked fine. Lee was brought back out, fastened in the noose, hood put over his head, and they tried it again. It didn't work, 3 times in all. By golly, thought the authorities, the entire experience was frighteningly perturbing and just a little bit disturbing. Executioner Barry wrote that some people believe there was a possibility of the trapdoor being swollen by the rain, but he added that they even cut the door with an axe and a plane, and it still didn't work when it needed to. In the end, he concluded that it was the iron catches that had somehow stuck when Lee's weight was on the trapdoor. It was one of the low points of his career. The British Home Secretary, Sir William Harcourt, commuted Lee's sentence, saying it would shock the feeling of anyone if a man had twice to pay the pangs of imminent death. Lee ended up serving 22 years behind bars. The thing is, investigations years later show that Lee might not have been the only person in the house that night, and he might have been wrongly convicted. Maybe there really was some divine intervention on his part. What's also a mystery is what happened to Lee after he was released. No one really knows, since he just kind of disappeared. Some rumors suggest he kept his head down and he moved to London, while others say he moved abroad. More recent research suggests that he went over the pond and that his grave is in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. That research asserts that he had abandoned his wife and 2 kids in England and started a new life in the States. It's possible he was buried there in 1945. Now let's have a look at 2 of some of the very worst punishments that humans have dished out. Choose from the videos The Catherine Wheel, Worst Punishments in the History of Mankind, and Drawn and Quartered, Worst Punishments in the History of Mankind.